Welcome, Rebels, to another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Gray, and today we're going to do my first ever deck tech video because up to this point, I've been talking a lot about theory and providing opinions on the game on this channel. And finally, well, I felt it was time to start chatting about a deck which I've actually had a blast playing personally for the past couple of months. And I call it General Mills because, well, that's a funny pun to me. Plus, it makes my wife laugh. So I've played well over 100 games with this deck in the past 2 months, and I've taken it to several small kit tournaments, 2 big monthly tournaments. My best records have been 3-2 and 2-2, and some of those games have been played under the old rules version 1.4, and I'm 90% positive that these old games go a lot differently if with the vibro knife change, because ultimately that was my demise in a lot of those games. And I'm not saying that now in 1.5 it's like a guaranteed win, because there's no deck like that, right? But I think my losses could have been slightly different or much closer games because they were already really close games. I'm talking getting people down to 5 cards in hand or 1 card in hand in a lot of cases. And that said, my goal today is to discuss the different elements of this deck, which I've published quite a few times on swdb.com, but I haven't in a while because I've been editing it quite a bit, so many times, in fact, that I've lost count at this point, because I change it every time the meta shifts a little bit. And I'll talk about the reason why I went for certain cards over others. I'll talk about cards that I've tried that kind of worked but were ultimately cut, and I'll also give you the strengths and weaknesses of the deck to tell you what's good about it and also how to beat it. And I think it's an important video for the current meta, as it's about a deck that probably should be in your gauntlet for the upcoming regional stuff. And there's going to be some content creators or people that disagree, and that's fine. But my reasoning for it is that I think there are a lot of aggro decks out there, and people are pretty used to playing against aggro decks, and not so much against mill. And dozens of the games that I've played, people are very confused about what they're supposed to be doing. They aggressively re-roll things like that. They get them into corners. They get themselves into corners, which they wouldn't do if they knew how to play against a deck like this or understood its strengths and its weaknesses. So don't count this one out, all right? I'm not saying that it's tier 1, but what I am saying is that it's could be considered part of a small set of tier 2 gatekeeper decks that will keep you out of the top cut if you are not ready to play against it. So let's talk about why after this. All right, so welcome to, again, my first deck tech video, and I apologize if this seems like there's a lot going on the screen. I'm going to try to figure out a really great format to make this look pretty good, hopefully over time. So let's start, right? The choice of characters here is pretty clear if you're running a mill deck in Empire at War. You've got the heaviest hitters on the hero side in this one with General Rieekan, Padme Amidala, and the J.Instructor there for her ability to tank. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on throughout this video with all the different components that are coming together to make that happen. So let's break down the choices for each a bit further. So let's start with the General, right? He's got great die sides for a support character, and he's bringing everything to the table that we need for mill, right? Firstly, he's got a ton of HP at 11. That's a lot of HP for Destiny. He can focus our other dice, which is what we're looking for, namely specials on Padme, right? He can give us shields, which is always worthwhile in this deck. We're going to talk about that too. Lastly, he packs the usual resource, which, you know, we're used to seeing on characters, but his activated ability is on point. It's where it's at, guys. Rieekan is the most aggressively milling character on the hero side of things because what he does just happens on activate. One of the themes that we've seen in Empire War is that activated abilities can be very strong. Rieekans can effectively give us 2 discard off the deck every single turn, and this is crucial to maximize, okay, every single round as well, because milling just 1 card off a deck instead of 2 effectively cuts him in half and puts pressure on Padme to pay for her 2 to sort of make up for it. In reality, there's no making up for a mill each turn. If you miss out on a card, you miss out on it, and you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do to get ahead of that again, right? And that can be really tough, right? So we're going to talk about what you're going to need to do to support General Rieekan's milling habit a bit later. But generally speaking, if your opponent is 2 turns away from damage, so let's say they haven't rolled anything out, maybe they played an upgrade, so they have to activate and then resolve. You can roll Padme in first, see what you get, and then you can roll Rieekan, right? Otherwise, rolling Rieekan out, if your characters are in danger of losing any of their shields or their last shield on them, then you want to roll him out first. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind as we go forward in terms of activation order. Padme Amidala, on the other hand, is the anchor to a lot of mill decks just due to her special, right? Which lets you mill 2 cards off the deck for 1 resource or 1 card if you just roll her special normally. And this is worth paying for every single turn if you can. You have a 33% chance to roll her special, although her discard side can also be worthwhile to resolve as well. In fact, it's her most immediately threatening side, as if your opponent spends a card to remove it, you've effectively milled them 1 card anyway, right? And you've also got rid of one of the removal cards, which is great. And the special can also be forced with cards like C-3PO, right? Because the special effectively counts as a 0, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later as well. And besides her 2 special sides and her 1 discard side, she's got a 2 focus side and also a resource. And her focus is another great target for C-3PO to convert into discards or perhaps shields or even resources if you need them. So you have options here. And although you're probably going to use it for discard most of the time, it's just good to know, to think outside the box a little bit in terms of options. And her 10 HP, it's okay, but most importantly, she gives us access to yellow cards, which are critical for removal, control, and one of the shield components of this deck, as well as one of the major win conditions, which we're going to talk about later, which is hyperspace jump. And of course, for the character last but not least is the J.Instructor, and she almost feels like a filler hero for this deck because she's 8 points. And if there was a better hero with the same or roughly equivalent HP, maybe had guarding or something like that, that would definitely be great to slot into this deck, right? But what Instructor brings us is access to blue cards for 2 things specifically, for Protective Mentor and for Caution. And you can see the deck list in the bottom right. And those are the only blue cards that are in the deck as it stands right now at the time of this video. And there are other considerations too, but those are really the only ones that are in now. And we're going to talk more about what those other considerations could be for people who have a slightly different play style than I have. And the goal of the Instructor is that she can be turned into a shield tank with Protective Mentor, and that's one of the best reasons to put Chance Cube on her early to kind of make your opponent think about, do I attack the Instructor or do I attack somebody else? But then if I do that, she kind of becomes this tank for them with her shields on them and all that. And furthermore, her activated ability is pretty great. It allows Rieekan to flip his die into 2 shields or 2 focus if you roll her focus or her shield. Even the resource can be worthwhile to turn his die to a resource. I find myself when I roll a blank and I'm like, oh, with another character, I roll her out, rolls a resource. I'm like, all right, yeah, I'm going to flip Padme to a resource just in case maybe I need to get out of the turn quick or something like that. And she does have great interaction with Padme outside of turning a focus with the ability or using her own focus die to flip Padme into specials. So, there's stuff there with her, not just Rieekan. And her damage sides can be useful to some degree. Like if your opponent is playing against you with the Qui-Gon deck, I recognize a lot of times, sometimes they just keep like the 1 shield on there. And maybe they're working on something else that's, doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes they do that. You can just use her melee or her range side to ping off the 1 shield, make them work to get it back on, It slows them down slightly. It's not a big deal. Generally speaking, it's going to be a reroll. You're not going to really resolve damage in this deck. Or, if you just have her and C-3PO out, you resolve her 1 as a discard or a shield or whatever, right? As a rule, she generally gets rolled in last to maximize her activated ability. But once you've got the Chance Cube on her, if you need resources a bit more, you might actually roll her out early. It really just depends on sort of the matchup, the board state, what you need, what you got in your hand, that kind of stuff. It takes some time, familiarity of playing the deck to really understand those things. And I think at its core, that's kind of what deck techs often highlight is here's how you play it, here's the structure of a deck, but you got to go out and add your own flair to it a little bit. So the final card we're going to talk about in this section is Command Center. And as for battlefield choice, I have to say I've been down many paths with this one, and anyone who plays in my local meta has certainly seen the variety of battlefields that I've brought here. I've tried Mos Eisley Spaceport, I've tried Main Plaza, I've tried War-Torn Streets, I've tried Echo Base, probably some others that I'm not remembering right now. But my opponent would choose my battlefield a lot just to deny me the starting shields, especially the people who have already played this deck against me or played me with this deck. And a lot of times I was working my mulligan basically into that, you know, like saying, well, this guy's not going to give me my shield, so I have to start determining what I want in my opening hand. But what I noticed that when I switched to Command Center is that people are very averse to choosing this battlefield, even if they run a faster deck than I do, and this deck is relatively so. And it does make some sense. I mean, if you give me the battlefield and you deny me shields, I can make up the mill by claiming early, probably. I might forego rolling out the Instructor in round 1 just to get the claim ability to actually go off. You know, if I can get shields on both my characters during my round, which would take 2 actions with starting resources, roll Rieekan for the mill, then Padme, resolve her dice for $1 if I can do that. You know, that's 5 or 6 actions. I might forego rolling out the Instructor just so that I can claim the Command Center, and that's essentially 6 mil for the turn. And the deck's goal, just so you know, is about 6 to 8 cards in their discard pile per turn. That's a mill that you do plus discards that they're doing to reroll. And if you can get 6 to 8 on turn 1, then you are off to a magnificent start with this deck. All right, so this is where the deck starts to make a little more sense, and that is the shield generation portion of this deck, which, when you learn later, combined with the control suite, is really part of a strategy to extend your game out to as long as possible to make your opponent use all their cards or to be able to forcibly get rid of all their cards. So along with the 30 HP that you just saw in the characters, this deck can produce a ridiculous amount of shields between these 5 cards, and there are 2 copies of each of these cards in the deck. So if you start off with shields, you've got 32 HP, you can really build from there. Vibro Knife, Lipo notwithstanding. So to really make it a pain on your opponent, I have all of these in the deck just to stay ahead of things, to stay ahead of damage, and to mitigate as necessary. So the first one is Hunker Down, you know, and this is just hands down an excellent card. You see it in a lot of decks. I mean, this isn't the only deck. There's a ton of decks that run this card. It takes a bit of craftiness, though, to keep it going against a melee deck, but nowhere near impossible. I've managed to do it with stuff like the Protective Mentor, doing a lot of work on the Instructor, reducing the damage from getting through to the character that it's on. The bad thing is that it slows the deck down. 2 actions in the first round you play it because you want to play it, you want to use it. But one thing that you'll figure out as you play the deck a bit more is that often many of these action abilities you have access to are things that are going to be done after your opponent claims. So sometimes, you know, it's better to just set up your board state post-claim and, you know, really unhindered to try to squeeze out all that stuff after the claim. And it's really rare as it is that you'll claim. So, you know, you shouldn't make it a priority. And instead, look at how you can use all those free actions to get shields on, you know, to use Hunker Down, and also something like Air Superiority, which is a lot like Hunker Down, right? But it's for any of your characters. It costs 1. You run 2 copies for that reason. It's going to give you 6 shields over the course of a game. Generally, I get through about 4 or 5 of those in the course of a game. I don't get through all 6, but I generally always put the second one on the table. So this is a great way, too, to get those first round shields on as you need them. If you suspect that your opponent is not going to let you take your battlefield, or if you're playing a best 2 or 3 and you won the first game and they're probably going to take their battlefield, again, you know, your battlefield again, just to upset you, not to give you shields. These are the 2 cards, you know, you want to look at for that stuff, you know. Also, it helps you get out of jams like, well, did they take Padme's shields before you could roll Rieekan? You can Air Superiority 1 onto her, right? It plays similarly to Hunker Down in that regard, and it's just a great setup card to have. Caution, again, this is one of the reasons we're playing blue. It's the best shield generating card in the game. You give up a die, you get 3 shields. It's an auto-include in the deck as long as it runs blue, right? In fact, for a long time, this was the only blue card in the whole deck because it's that good. And it's just, you know, it is better than resolving Rieekan's 1 or 2 shield side in a lot of cases because you can just blow his die with caution to give 3 to anyone else, right? And it makes the decision to resolve that Jedi Instructor's die, really easy. You don't. You can cannibalize it with this, right? Boost Padme, boost Rieekan. A lot of synergy with this particular deck in general. Now, Entrenched is one that some people shy away from because it is 3. But it's one of those mid to late game cards. Once you've got a healthy stash of resources, say you're in the 4 to 5 range, thanks to some Chance Cube and the Instructor giving you some extra resources, Entrenched then becomes a great money play. Your opponent just got rid of all your shields and they were working on your character's HP a little bit. Now you're dropping Entrenched. Give them 5 more, right? Make it a hassle for them. Make them waste a lot of time trying to chew through shields. There's also a Hail Mary play that you can make happen if you have 4 resources, and I've done this one a few, where you might have a ton of shields already on your guys, let's say 5 plus, and you all quiet in the front, remove all your shields, or at least 5 of them, and then you pay 3, play Entrenched, put them all back on, you mill 5 with all quiet. That's actually won me a couple of games, and it's something that's really interesting, and it's part of the options, the tricks that this deck has. Spirit of Rebellion, again, really simple. It's just a better take cover in red. The first time it's worth 1 shield. The second time it's worth 2. It has good value, and it's another one of those cards for the moment when you know your opponent is going to take your battlefield and deny you the shield, right? It's not a lot to be said here. It's a good shield card. It's a no-brainer on this one. But if there's anything better at 0 cost in the future, this may be something that gets, replaced. All right, so now we're trying to make a buttload of shields to stay alive in this deck, but we can't withstand firepower of every magnitude. We are, in fact, going to be using some actions to control dice on the board because we need to preserve some of our shields, and we need to do that as best we can, and removing a 2 or 3 damage side for 1 resource or 0 is a better trade-off than trying to generate that many shields for the same cost. In fact, we can't always do that. Removal is, of course, always effective in Destiny. So here are the cards that I've included, and there are 2 copies of each of these in the deck right now. I think, except Sound the Alarm, there's only 1. And that's because I had to choose between either an additional flank or a hyperspace jump, but you can sort of play around with it, figure out what you want. So let me go through what some of these cards are. Starting with Protective Mentor, which we've already talked about a little bit. And Protective Mentor is a card that has held this deck together for some time. And in many, not all, but certainly many games, it has been the difference between losing a character and not losing a character. Having Rieekan online or not having Rieekan online. Or even just winning or losing the game, period. Protective Mentor is there to protect Padme and Rieekan primarily, although the way I use it is by putting the first one I get on the J.Instructor and working on getting her to max shields, and then Padme can get 1 shield. Remember, you can load up Mentor with 3 shields, and then you can liberally reduce 2 damage to anyone else by using the Mentor character shields and maintaining 1 on her. For her own personal use with Rieekan. And this is also how you protect your Hunker Downs from being discarded by anything doing less than 4 to 7 damage, right? So tinker around with this card because it's very, very interesting. I feel like it's one of those rule-bending cards that people sort of didn't really look at because there isn't a good way to use it in a lot of decks. And personally, I think it's a great card. And I feel that it is super underrated at 0. The next card, Electroshock. Again, not much to say here. I run this as a 1-of just to get rid of a special here and there or something I don't want. I don't like Spot Yellow, as once Padme dies, it's offline. It's still, though, it's super useful to have in your hand. It doesn't get a second spot because of other better removal or just cheaper cost removal. Flank. Obviously, this is great in the early game, especially since the deck plays really slow and you want to maximize an ideal activation order. It starts to lose value a little bit later in the game as you're inevitably going to lose characters. It can hit any die, though, and that's why it's so damn good, because you can remove a Sabine 3, you can remove whatever you want. I probably didn't need to even really say all that, but there you have it. Law of Cat and Mouse, of course, right? This is a hero staple for removal. Losing a die does suck, but it's a necessarily evil to pluck something like a Sonic Cannon die that might be showing 6 off of the table. Now, I've tried actually running the deck without any loft cats in the past, and my win rate completely tanked. So for loft cat, ideally you want to give up the Jedi Instructor's die, and this is a case where maybe you roll her out first, right? Maybe you bounce the chance cube to your hand if you played it on her and you think she's going to die or whatever, or you want to protect the chance cube die from being removed by a loft. And then you loft cat next turn because you kind of know that your opponent's going to roll out or whatever, and then maybe you replay the chance cube later. So there's ways to play around loft cat. Remember, all your characters are only one die, so if you're trying to protect their die, you don't want to give your opponent too many options. It's a good card. Don't doubt it. Just put it in your deck. You're going to find ways to play it smartly, intelligently rather. There's definitely ways to do it. Sound the Alarm, right? It's probably the best soft removal card in the game. It's 0 cost, which is really why it sees play in this deck. Previously, I was running dodge and block for the big blowout plays, but I find that Sound the Alarm generally has better odds on reducing damage. I tended to hold on to blocks and dodges through rounds, which was kind of annoying. Some characters are also just immune to it, like if Django rolls really well. If Sabine plays an ambush weapon, rolls out, God rolls, what are you going to do with dodge, right? But again, Sound the Alarm, good odds to reduce damage. It can also make it worse, right? But that's just it. It's odds. It's a dice game. And it feels bad when, you lose that reroll. But, the rest of the time, it's A-okay in my book. It also has the intended side effect, if you make them reroll into terrible stuff, of making them discard. So you're making discards happen with a removal card. That can be a pretty good side effect for a mill deck, right? In fact, it's the best side effects that you want. And then maybe they don't roll well and they're discarding another card, maybe another one, while they try to fix their dice. So you can use them back to back for maximum lulls if you really want to, or don't. Actually, the real advice here is that you should use them wisely because you've only got 2 of them. Yeah, it's actually 2 of them in this deck list, but if you're only running 1 of them, you definitely got to use that one wisely. And last but not least, Hyperspace Jump is both a great board control card and also a win condition for this particular deck. There is no more satisfying feeling than your opponent having no deck and then they discard their last card to reroll so that they can try to get damage to end the game. And they've got an Ancient Lightsaber and they're like, oh, I'm going to reroll first and then I'll bounce the Ancient Lightsaber and then I'll screw them up, whatever. And then they reroll and you hyperspace jump them for the win, and they get really upset because then they say, oh, next turn I was going to bounce my Ancient Lightsaber and all this stuff. But they didn't get to do that. But besides that, it lets you swap the command center into play if you've been playing on their battlefield for the whole game. So you can use it mid-game for that kind of tech if you really want to. It's really also a get out of jail for 3 card is what I call it. Yes, it's expensive, and its resource costs also matches Entrenched. So these are the highest cost cards in the deck. And one of the interesting things is being the same cost as Entrenched for those repeat matches. There's sometimes a little mind game that you get to play with Hyperspace Jump. People are like, well, is he trying to build up to 3 for Entrenched for shields, or is he trying to get out of this round? So do I die fix for max damage, or do I just cut my losses and say, I know he's going to Hyperspace Jump me if I do that? So there's a lot of stuff that's there in terms of the metagame. Personally, I love this card. It's now a 2 of in my deck after being a 1 of for a very long time. I hated losing the only copy if it was in my hand and then not knowing how I would nail the win con, like for sure. Or, I would get it in my opening hand after the mulligan and I'm forced to hold on to it the whole game when there's only 1 copy. You can't play this deck with 4 cards in your hand every round. You really need all your options on the table. So that's why there's 2 copies now, because maybe I can, pitch one to the discard if I feel like I really don't need it and wait for the second one to come around for that big blowout play at the end of the game. All right, this is all building up, right? So we're making a ton of shields. We're playing around with damage through Protective Mentor. We're controlling dice as we normally do. Well, what's next? Well, Chance Cube is next, is what? And Chance Cube has 2 purposes in this game. The first is what you would expect, right? It's supposed to make money. And the second is to be a target for C-3PO's action. Now, the chance cube is going to be converted into discard most of the time through C3PO, but there's no shame in resolving it for shields if you really need them. And I can't see too much of a reason to resolve the 3 side as anything other than those 2 things, but focus could work also, I guess. In fact, that's not that bad of an idea, again, depending on the board state, but generally C3PO is going to be like the last thing you sort of fire off at the end of the turn after you've seen your options. Or you could try to get to it right away, right? You got to roll C3PO, got to roll the chance cube die in, got to fix the chance cube in a lot of cases, and then go right after it with C3PO. Now, chance cube, it's a game winner. It will also help you avoid being milled out by other decks as well, because you can bounce it back to your hand. If you don't want to pay for it, you choose not to pay for it. You can take care to protect these cards. You got to take care to protect these cards because they are really, really critical to the strategy of this deck. A rend will absolutely kill you if you cannot play around it or you see it coming and you just neglect to do anything about it. C3PO, so there's been a few games that I've actually won without C3PO in my time of playing this deck, but more often than not, he's on the table at the end of the game doing something. One piece of advice on this one, be careful of using the second copy of C3PO to simply re-roll in some of your matchups, okay? If your opponent is running ATDP or ATST, you're going to have a bad day with that special. You do not want to just discard your second copy of C3PO, because that can literally be, you lose the game now, right? Other than that, he's safe on most games once you get him on the table. His goal is to either roll that 1 discard side to sort of threaten removal of his die, or to convert a 2 or 3 value side somewhere on the table into discards, right? So Rieekan's die becomes a really good target when you already have shields, but Chance Cube becomes his primary target. You want to hit that 2 or that 3 resource side over there. J.Instructor damage sides, as I mentioned earlier, can also be useful to throw at this as well. But you really want to shoot to maximize it to about 2. 2 values where you want to be. But if you can get it maxed up to 3, that's really awesome. And you're going to see what this die and what his action is really made of in that sense. All Quiet on the front. Okay, earlier I had mentioned the neat combo play that you can do with All Quiet on the front and Entrenched. But it stands alone well enough on its own as well. And one of the mistakes, though, that I've seen people make with this card is trying to hit for 8 or 9 discard, okay? Yes, that's the dream, okay? But listen, you're rarely going to be actually sitting at maximum shields unless you're playing like another mill deck, okay? If this card is in your hand and you have the ability to use it for about 5 or 6, that's usually pretty good. Heck, even at 3 or 4, it's good, okay? Only, like I said, only against another mill deck are you actually going to be able to max out your shield. Against most aggro-heavy decks, it's not going to happen. So look to play 1 copy for about between 3 and 5, and if you can do the second copy to empty out their deck, or maybe you're using 1 copy to re-roll and you're using the second copy to zero out their deck, that's what you want to be doing. Because that 3 to 4 to 5 range, especially that 5 range, you got to look at it as that's cutting off an entire round from your opponent's game, right? That's how mill players think. And to avoid telegraphing this thing, I usually start asking my opponent for a count of cards in their deck after their draw at the start of round 3, and then again at the start of round 4. And while they're counting, I might look in their discard just to see what kind of removal they've already used, and then I can, count how many cards they've got on the table in their hand, in their discard, and sort of do a backwards check just to make sure that everything is good and that I'm on track, okay? And, there's ways to use this card to make it really useful. I just don't want you to think of this card as one that you absolutely have to maximize by trying to remove 8 shields or 9 shields from your guys, okay? Don't think of it like that. Think about increments, all right? That's really important. Friends in low places, another standard include. It's 1 card for 1 discard, ideally. Its primary target is to removing removal cards like their electroshocks, their feel your angers, especially things like that. And since you only really care about protecting Padme's die in this deck, you want to use this before you roll her in, more or less, when you think you got some time in the round. Remember that it is a spot yellow, so if Padme's going down and you've got 1 or both of these in your hand, you might be rushed to get these out of your hands before they're dead cards. So you got to keep that in mind throughout your game, because getting rid of those 2 cards with friends in low places can also make the difference, right? Because again, hero mill has a really difficult time getting cards out of people's hands. That's why this stuff like with like C3PO and Chance Cube is super important, because if you neglect those cards and they get blown off the table by an ATDP or a Rend or something like that, chances are you've lost the game. It's going to be super difficult to make it up with this set of characters, because the only one that has a discard side is Padme. She's only got a 1 on it. So I've talked about the 30 cards that I actually included in the deck, but it wasn't without a lot of testing that I actually settled on those 30 cards. In fact, there's a multitude of cards that have been in this deck and ultimately did not make today's final cut. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those now, and they're all right here in the stream for you to see. We'll start off with Dodge and Block. These are 2 cards that I think have a lot of value in the meta right now, and I'm sure many would disagree. I've heard people also just straight up disagreeing. And my thought on it with the meta slowing is that with the meta slowing down from the automatic flip die and resolve tactics, what we have are die that we can see more often and manage to a higher degree. Dodge and Block fit the bill here, but sadly, they cost too much for this particular deck to really make consistent use out of them. Ultimately, these were cut for the additional hyperspace jump and the inclusion of some other removal cards. You know, it's still, after playing so many games with them, it doesn't feel right, if that makes any sense. But for now, these are going to be on the outside looking in, at least for a little while. Crate Dragon Howl is a very interesting removal option in this deck that really comes in and out of my deck sometimes. And it's really fun early in the game to see your opponent flip 2 cards off their deck to keep like a 2 damage or a 3 damage for a $1 die. Well, that's an entire Rieekan activation or a Padme special for 1 resource, and this costs 0, so that feels like it's totally worth it. The problem is the choice is too open, and players with experience against the deck will play around it better than most. Still, it's 0 cost, and you know, sometimes I do regret cutting it. The saved resources from the shocks and the flanks could go a long way in the deck, but at the end of the day, it really didn't make the same impact as the other cards that made the deck list in the bottom right. Confidence suffers from a similar problem as above. Firstly, it's no doubt card, okay, in terms of removal. In fact, it outright stinks in comparison, but it has its uses, and it's 0 cost. Confidence can crumble a chain of modified damage by removing the single black side from the table. It can generate rerolls as well. Its biggest drawback is the die still gets resolved against you as normal as the opponent, and the opponent gets to choose where, assuming it's a damage die, right? If you want to target damage, if you want to allow them to target damage at you, you got to be really careful with Confidence, and that's what I don't like about it. It's too thinky of a removal card. I just want to remove die, okay? It's best used, of course, in any other side other than damage, but the problem is that it's also useless against blanks. So I felt that it was less impactful to me than the other removal as well, so I cut it after a relatively short run of only about 5 or 6 games with it. It just wasn't working for me. Feint is probably the most interesting of these cuts, and occasionally I still think about re-including it in the deck. And it's for this reason. In a world where aggro dominates, getting 2 activations out of Rieekan's ability in a single round could be really great. The problem I found with it is that it really impacts my turn order a good deal, sometimes uncomfortably so. It puts the tempo of the deck 1 extra turn behind, which isn't like a deal breaker or whatever, but if shields are stripped before the second activation, then it feels really bad to play Feint. And the other problem is that on the turns where I might actually get 4 cards off the deck, the 1 resource I spent on Feint might have been just used for Padme special or some other removal card or something. Yes, I still get 1 additional card off the deck if I resolve Padme special just for 1, so that's fine. You know, does speed up the mill a little bit, but it never really seemed to amount to anything super significant. I did about 25 games with this card, and it just didn't stick with me. And it might be one of the worth giving an extra shot in the event that better removal comes out, or some way to protect shields a bit more, or manipulate damage, or something like that. Maz's Goggles and Scout. I put these 2 together since they ultimately do this roughly the same thing. And I think Scout is actually, of course, the better choice because it doesn't discriminate by card type, guaranteeing a discard every time you roll the special. Plus, it's got 2 special sides. Maz's Goggles only has 1. You can also only have 1 Maz's Goggles on the table. You can have 2 Scouts on the table. Maz's Goggles is a spot yellow requirement, etc. So anyway, Scout, it's a good include in this deck for obvious reasons. It helps hit the hand a bit more. It takes the pressure off C-3PO and Chance Cube a little bit if you can sort of get a card every single round. But despite adding consistent and improved hand discard, I don't run them. And I rely instead on the burst discard from C-3PO, letting friends in low places do the work as late into the game as I can manage. Some people might be uncomfortable with that, so they might want to include Scout or Goggles. Just beware that of your cost curve, as that is also a consideration here. This deck runs very, very lean on resources. It really cannot afford any extra spending, and it certainly can't afford constantly discarding to try to get this thing to turn special either. Strike Briefing and Secret Mission. I lump these cards together because they both trade 1 card for 1 mil. And I generally found these to be lower impact than everything else for the actual deck slot. Strike Briefing, though, is the better of the two, if you ask me. It lets you look deeper into the deck, pluck a specific card. Also, the hand knowledge for next turn can be excellent alongside Scout or Goggles or even Friends in Low Places. But in order to maximize these, you need 2 of each of them, and that's 4 cards. And you got to ask yourself, where's the spot in the deck here? I'm not sure. That there are even 2 spots, let alone 4, and that's sort of the problem, right? You could almost run this deck entirely on events and 2 upgrades and C-3PO, but you'd be giving up either control or shields to fit these things in. So, these didn't get included because they hit the deck in a deck that already mills relatively fast, and they're not very efficient at doing that, right? It's 1 card for 1 mill. Now, if either of these milled 2, they would probably be in the deck. If there was ever like a hero version of Loose Ends that milled 4 cards or something like that, that would definitely be in the deck for the same reasons, because it becomes more efficient for the deck slot. And when we break it down, the reason a lot of these other cards are considered other considerations is because efficiency becomes the highest tier argument when you're down to the last few deck slots. And unfortunately, these just didn't make the cut because they're not as efficient as the cards that are already included. So we've come down to it. We've looked at all the cards in the deck. So let's talk about some strengths and weaknesses. And, it's not exactly this thing is not exactly winning tournaments left and right, but it is threatening, and it is being annoying to many of the decks out there and the players out there, because it's one of those decks that can win just by drawing better than you and milling the right cards at the right time, which of course is totally random, right? But anyway, let's get to this. So the first strength that I want to highlight about this deck is that it mills very, very fast, all right? The deck mills a player's deck so freaking quickly, you're going to be out of cards before you even realize it. And that happens between Rieekan's potential 2, Padme's potential 2, the C-3PO combos that we've highlighted, your opponent discarding to reroll, and stuff like that. And you're going to be eating away at their deck under good conditions, lightning fast compared to some other mill decks. And what you got to realize here is that it's a consistent mill. It's not like a buyout mill deck, which is a lot more burst mill. And overall, it's probably the most consistent round by round mill out there right now. And that's really a good thing. And that's enabled by all of the cards that you've seen today. The second big strength to it is that it survives. The deck starts with 30 HP, possibly 32 if it gets its shields, and then it's built to sustain an attack. It's built very anti-aggro by allowing you to generate a butt ton of shields, as we illustrated earlier. You slap that together with control cards, stuff like Hyperspace Jump, the taunt-like ability of Protective Mentor, and you can really extend your game into round 5 if you get the right cards in your hand and your opponent is maybe not rolling super well and you're getting the right cards with the mill. It's not going to happen often, and in fact, ideally, you want to end the game in round 4. You don't want to go to round 5. But if you need to go the distance, that right set of cards will actually get you there with this deck. Third, it has tricks. Now, don't be fooled that this deck is just a mill deck with a control suite and a shield suite. There's some really good combos here. C3PO obviously lies at the center of it, but his ability to convert those 2 and 3s into shields, discard, disrupt, even more resources can really change the game significantly. On top of that, hyperspace jump can be a win condition. Also, you don't need to fear things like Luke's protection and ancient lightsabers with this deck near the end of the game. You can learn after a couple of times setting up your hand right, and here's how it goes. You want to hold on to one all quiet on the front, and you want to leave the C3PO die out there with a value of 1 or 2 showing on another die. That way you can handle any up to 2 discard scenario, and also mill with a certain amount of shields in your characters. So, if they put the saber back on their deck and they've got no cards in hand, you can use all quiet to get rid of the saber. If they decided to return something to their hand, you can C3PO that. I've never actually found myself in this loop at the end of the game because some way, somehow, the deck can deal with the deck restoring cards and the discard stuff in the final round. It takes a little bit of practice with the deck and to get familiar with how to set up those tricks so that you're not caught in a loop of them putting a card back on their deck like Luke's an ancient lightsaber and also being able to hit their hand and stuff like that. Again, just take some practice. I put this one down as imperviousness, but really what I mean to say is that the deck has really lackluster removal targets. The only die that most of my opponents feel is actually worth removing in most cases is the Padme die. As the game progresses, the C3PO die becomes increasingly important, sometimes a chance cube die, although most people aren't afraid of you having money so much as what you do with it. So to many opponents, removing these die feels bad, and it also causes them to spend a card. So even if the full effect doesn't happen where, you're working yourself up to using that chance cube for 3, they get rid of C3PO's die. Well, you got the benefit of a partial discard because they had to remove the die. So that's something to be happy about. And the last strength I think the deck has, and I mentioned it before, is the archetype advantage. Sadly, most players don't know how to play against a mill deck. I would say that I've won about 90% of my games against first-time opponents simply because they have no idea what's going on or how to play against a mill deck in general. They've never seen the deck before. They don't know about its weaknesses, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. And against a mill deck this fast, they're losing cards quicker than they'd like. And the tools that they need and that they've put into the deck to satisfy their win condition, under normal conditions, are becoming unavailable very fast. They're seeing their cards hit the discard pile, and sometimes they just want to cry about it because they don't know how else to feel. But ultimately, this is advantageous to you because, well, your opponent is essentially forced to determine a new path to victory. And if the old one is working out, because the old one isn't working out well enough for them, and that can really throw a player off when you make them sort of have to change their mind or their mental tempo throughout a game. It can really be jarring, and that puts you in a driver's seat when you're playing against an aggro deck player that really has no idea what to do. And one of the ways you can really tell that you've got an advantage too, is that once it's round 3, if they've got around a third of their deck only left to work with, and they haven't done meaningful damage to you, the game is essentially going in your favor, and you're probably going to win just by outpacing them with mill, controlling key dice. You really want to test their ability to remove. You want to attack them as hard as you possibly can, because most of the time when I'm having them do their round 3 count, if they're at about 13 cards, 14 cards, I'm pretty happy with that. But if round 4 starts and they've got like 5 or 6 left and they've got a full hand, I'm kind of worried because I didn't do enough in round 3. That can really be the defining factor here, right? You want to keep up that pace, again, 6 to 8 mil per round if possible, so that by the end of round 4 you can hyperspace jump for the win or get them into some kind of mental battle with you for the win so that you can pull it out. All right, no deck is without its weaknesses, okay? And the first one that I want to talk about in this deck is Disrupt, okay? If you're looking for the first way to beat the Rieekan mill deck, it's Disrupt. Disrupt turns off hyperspace jump. It turns off entrenched. It disables the chance cube because they need $1 to roll it out. If you can zero out their resources, you're relegating this deck to also playing Loftcat as its only removal, which is forcing them to remove a die. Then you're going to force them to activate characters in a bad order. You're going to disable flank. At that point, you're going to really cause a lot of the components of this deck to crumble. Choked resources really is probably this deck's worst nightmare. I certainly know that it is mine when I'm playing it. The second, of course, are shield hate cards. As shields are coming back into fashion and vogue, shield hate's coming right along for the ride, guys. Cards like Intimidate, On the Hunt, Vibroknife, TIE Fighter, Handcrafted Lipo, they absolutely destroy this deck. So, you think you got Rieekan set up for the 2 mil, huh? Nope. Intimidate is instant. Halves your effectiveness right away. Now everything's slowed down for this deck. Shield hate hurts bad. Probably about as bad as Disrupt. The easiest way to play around this deck's win condition is also to slow it down, slow Rieekan's mill down, and to do that, you can split your damage between the shielded characters to at least ping the shields off of one, then focus on the other. So even if Protective Mentor is going to block, 2 to 3 of the 6 incoming damage or 5 incoming damage if it's a weird number, go after the Instructor, get rid of her shields, turn Protective Mentor off, and then you can attack the actual target that you want to do. But if you can ping off, if you've got 2 black sides and Padme and the Instructor each have 1 shield on them, split them, take the shields out. Make the mill player work to get those shields back on. Because when you think about what you've heard about and what you've seen today, you know for a fact that in order to get a shield on, it's going to cost me at least 1 card. In order to get another shield on, it's going to cost me another card or another action. The fact is, it's going to slow you down like pretty terribly, right? Of course, you have to remember to stay ahead on damage in a world where you're, in a game where you're splitting up damage like that, right? So, but if you can get Rieekan turned off, it becomes a cakewalk because then you're not going to lose two cards per round. And if you're talking the game's going 4 rounds, that's 8 cards you're saving. Even if you save half that, you save 4 cards. So that can be really significant. The next one is that there is an unbalanced importance or emphasis on cards in this deck, right? It's reliant on a very, very small set of cards to win, namely C-3PO and the Chance Cube. So I've mentioned earlier, ATDP, ATST destroys C-3PO, Rend destroys Chance Cube in particular. So if things like Holocron and Imperial Inspection start coming back into vogue, we might see a return of Rend. But I think Chance Cube justifies running Rend sometimes in certain decks. So, you think about the amount of resources that this thing can generate over the course of a game. If every round I'm able to flip this thing to 3 resources over 3 rounds, I've just made 9 resources. That's 2 hyperspace jumps and an entrenched. That's 2 entrenched or 10 shields and a hyperspace jump. Chance Cube is a major target in this game, and you should remove it, even though you think that this deck is impervious to removal, which I talked about in the previous section. It's because of player psychology. They're thinking, man, removing a Chance Cube is pointless, right? It's just giving reason. No. There's a reason that they're playing a Chance Cube, and there's a reason they got a C-3PO out. Recognize right away that those 2 cards need to go. And if you can remove even one of their die, you cut off the combo from both sides, right? It's like a 2-headed snake. If you kill one, well, the whole thing dies, right? The other problem with it is that this deck runs a very small amount of dice. Now, my version only runs 6 dice. 2 of them are Chance Cubes. 1 of them is a C-3PO. You can only have 1 copy. So at most, I got 6 die in play, right? And 3 of those die are character die. And that's the other thing. All 3 characters are single die. So die control works wonders against this deck. If you can control Padme's die every single round, you just remove 2 mil probably from the equation if they were trying to get there with it. If you ping those shields off on the other characters other than Rieekan, you're slowing down the deck by 2 right again there. Remember that the C-3PO play is pretty telegraphed. Padme is the only early game die that is really a threat. Chance Cubes are inconsistent without a focus die to show. And this deck, it doesn't want to use Padme's focus and only sometimes wants to use Rieekan's focus, because the shields sometimes are a better bet, especially if you're playing against an aggro deck. So with so few dice, the emphasis is really on removing the really, really important ones. And in order of importance, that's Padme, C-3PO, and Chance Cube, or maybe even late game it's C-3PO, Padme, Chance Cube, something like that. The last weakness here is that this deck is very easily outpaced or out-teched, and this is a problem that mill decks in general have. Probably the biggest normal problem this deck has is just also being very slow. It's not the absolute slowest deck in the meta, but it's pretty low in the totem pole as far as speed is concerned. And the reason why this can be a problem is that it is easy to be outpaced in terms of how quickly this deck can get to the claim, which is not very quickly. And falling behind quickly and consistently over the course of many, many rounds can be a real problem. Furthermore, even though it does have a good removal suite, it can still be out-teched by decks with a lot of dice to them. Remember that mill? It's not killing any of your characters typically, so that means that each and every round, you're going to have to deal with all their characters rolling out, being upgraded, adding dice to the board, and all the rest of that stuff. And that is a challenge if you don't happen to mill out all their best cards, if you don't get rid of their upgrades. And against a deck like Sabine, well, you're just helping her by discarding stuff, right? So in games like that, this deck just loses. And you'll find out that most of the losses in this deck are going to happen when you get outpaced by aggro a significant amount, and they just get ahead of you in damage versus your mill. And that's a wrap, folks. That's basically everything I had to say about this Rieekan mill deck. Obviously, my variation on the deck isn't the most definitive by any means, and I wouldn't claim that. It's just a version that works best for me based on my local meta and some games on TTS. I don't do a whole lot of TTS, as you guys already know. There are plenty of cards, too, that you can include in the section on the other considerations, but we could be here for hours if we did that. Like, we didn't talk about Field Medic, for example. I'm sure a lot of people are like, what about Field Medic, right? Anyways, if you had been waiting for some new content, I do apologize for skipping a release last Thursday/Friday. Honestly, with PAX Unplugged happening this past weekend, I think all our thoughts were fixated on that and what was happening there. So I didn't feel bad not putting on a video on Friday. Hey, I was busy too. I had stuff to do. I also wanted to follow the PAX Unplugged news over the weekend. So that said, with the holiday here, I wouldn't expect anything until next Tuesday or Wednesday as well. I'm going to be busy hosting my in-laws here, and shooting a video is just not going to be on my immediate to-do list. All right. Okay, folks, so I hope you enjoyed this one. If you like what you just watched and you haven't subscribed yet, maybe you'll consider doing so. Also, maybe you could tell your friends to come on over, check it out. Maybe they'll like it enough to hit that big red subscribe button down there too. Remember also that you can check out my other social media connections in the show notes as well. And so until next time, all right, guys, I want you to avoid having a bad feeling if you can help it. Check your power cables from Minox, and may the force be with you.